For many years, the Danganronpa franchise has graced players with stylistic ways of killing off its many beloved characters. No approach is more iconic than the over-the-top executions administered to those students who are found guilty of murder. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the top 10 executions of Danganronpa as a whole. Before we begin, I'll first explain the criteria for how I ranked these different executions. The first is impact on the blackened. Just how did they react to their own executions? Did it fill them with despair, or maybe give them some other kind of feeling? Number 2 is the impact on the class. How are the people who are forced to watch this execution reacting to it as a whole? Lastly, number 3, the execution of the execution. All of these executions are based around different talents, so how well did it incorporate the talent into the execution? Also, in case it wasn't obvious, yes, this video is filled with spoilers, so watch at your own peril. Without further ado, let's get right into it. I'm Stanpai, and these are my top 10 Danganronpa executions. Coming in at number 10 is the first execution to make the list, the unforgettable execution of Kaito Mota, the ultimate astronaut. This remaster of Jin Kirigiri's execution is a terrific play by the developers, and the students of V3 are all heartbroken to see their beloved astronaut burrow through the Earth before being lifted off into space to meet his end. There's just one thing that stops this execution from ranking higher on the list. It doesn't actually kill him. Kaito's premature demise is the result of his illness, and it comes just after his dream of reaching space is fulfilled. If anything, this execution is a gift more than a punishment, and that is why it clocks in at number 10. The actual victim of this execution isn't Kaito, but instead, Kibo's Ahoge antenna. Coming in at number 9 is Tonkatsu No Honolua, known in English as deep-fried teru teru. While managing to tug on a few heartstrings in his cries for his mother, the ultimate chef is subjected to one of the most painful executions to date. Utilizing a volcano, teru teru is battered and fried in hot magma. While the actual punishment itself is really only at its most painful during the tempura session, the momentary suffering inflicted by a searing volcano is enough to get him on the list. If you've ever stuck your hand into a deep fryer, you'd probably understand why. Talk about hot and heavy. At number 8, we have another entry from Danganronpa 2, Gundam Tanaka Stampede. Tanaka's execution is a bit exceptional. Had he not committed the murder, it's very likely that all of the students would have died. For this reason, he isn't met with a lot of animosity from his class. His execution itself features a Stampede charging headlong into the ultimate breeder. Inscribing a transmutation circle to summon his own magic to protect him, his delusions come to an abrupt halt as his body is tossed into the sky by the oncoming animals. Sharing his final moments beside his beloved Dark Divas, the final punishment is not to die, but to see his soul taken to heaven. For an overlord whose domain resides in hell, there is no greater punishment. Beyond the execution, Tanaka's class is deeply moved by his death. They consider it a sacrifice, and find a new sense of meaning in their own lives because of it. Number 7 on the list comes from Danganronpa V3, and is known as Bug's Panic, or Wild West Insecticide, depending on which version of the game you played. Gonta's execution follows a heartbreaking trial in which the entire class reluctantly is forced to vote for him as the Blackened, despite their wishes not to do so. The last thing he ever says to the class is, "Gonta love you all!" In this execution, we are taken to a western standoff where Monokuma unloads a Hornet Gatling gun on Gonta and his alter ego, while Monophony is going into labor. As his body is mangled in insect stings, Monophony's baby erupts from her belly as a massive bug with scythe-like limbs. After dispatching these last two monocubs, the beast flies straight into Gonta and stabs him through the chest. The execution concludes with Monokuma firing a flamethrower onto Gonta's body, burning him, the bug, and alter ego all at once. This execution loses points due to the presence of the monocubs, and because, in general, it didn't really capture what I believe to be a proper execution for the character, focusing more on the different characters that were all around him. Number 6 on the list is called the Cultural Melting Pot in the West, but for the purpose of this list will be referred to by its Japanese title, Picture Scroll of Punishments Past and Present. By the end of Case 3, Shinguji Kurekyo is one of the most reviled Blackened to ever grace the stage, yet he welcomes his own death with open arms. His belief in the occult and that he will not only be reunited with his sister, but also persist as a ghost, grants him complete comfort leading into his execution. Incorporating different aspects of Japanese cultural history, Shinguji is tied up and spun around before being cut loose and dropped into a boiling pot where he is shortly after met with his demise. The main event behind this execution isn't in his death, but rather in the aftermath. After being cooked alive, Shinguji's spirit is reunited with his dearly beloved sister, the catalyst and motivation for his many murders throughout his life. Embracing in each other's arms, he is granted not suffering, but peace and joy through this execution. It is at this time that a Monokuma monk emerges and pours salt on the folklorist. The bear is then joined by Sister, and Korekio's spirit is exorcised under the moonlight. While this execution isn't one that caused despair in his classmates, it earns huge points for incorporating the death of a Monokub in a way that didn't detract from the execution itself, while also being absolutely loaded with talent-related theming in of itself. One last little detail is the fact that no matter how far you go, even in death, you cannot escape Monokuma. Number 5 on the list comes to us from Danganronpa 2, and it's called One Woman Army. Peko Pekoyama's execution comes after a heart-wrenching trial, where Kazuryu and Peko face the reality of their relationship. After determining that she isn't just some tool to be used, but her own person, her sentence is then carried out. Monokuma strings up Peko like some kind of marionette, and uses her body as a weapon to slaughter countless Monokuma warriors. As she fights on, Kazuryu is forced to watch, unable to do anything to help her. As she becomes overwhelmed by the soldiers, he finally makes his move and runs to her, only for her own blade to slice him across the face. A cruel burden for the woman whose entire life was devoted to protecting this man. Holding on to her beloved master one last time, the duo are routed and stabbed repeatedly by the Monokuma army. This execution was a phenomenal way to utilize Peko's talent, and because of Kazuryu's intervention, it has an extra layer of despair and meaning behind it, putting it in the top 5. Number 4 on this list is the very first blackened execution in the Danganronpa franchise, The 1000 Blows, starring Leon Kuwata. Leon's execution follows the first ever class trial, and at this point in time, none of the students had any idea what punishment actually meant. Crying out on behalf of his own innocence until the very end, Leon is taken to the batting cages and strung up for Monokuma. From there, the bear swings an endless barrage of baseballs at Leon's body, covering him from head to toe in bruises and broken bones. This execution probably is higher than most would expect to see it on the list, but it earns its place for 3 reasons. 1. Leon himself was not a fan of baseball, and to be killed by means of batting practice is a horrible nightmare come true. 2. The level of pain he endures during this execution before succumbing to his wounds is incredible. The blunt trauma of being smashed repeatedly by baseballs is a feeling I wouldn't wish on anyone, and it was so extreme that they actually censored it in the anime. 3, and most important, precedent. Being the first ever execution, Leon's death sets a horrifying precedent before the class. As his lifeless corpse hangs before them, they are all filled with dread, uncertainty, and fear of what is to come. No other execution in the franchise captures this as well as Leon's, and that gives it a top spot in this list. Kirumi Tojo's Thread of Agony comes in at number 3. A number of things make this execution significant. The first is the scene that plays out just before it. Even though her class voted for her, they still can't help but root for her as she runs with absolute determination and resolve to escape. And in a way, her determination is kind of like their own. The refined maid is described as having lost all of her grace in her attempts to survive, and this theme carries into the execution that follows. Faced with an angry mob, Tojo's role as Prime Minister is brought into question, and her escape is in her own hands. A long, thorny vine is extended to her from a high ceiling. A chance at life, so long as she can climb it. Tossing her pain aside, she claws her way up the thorns. Suddenly, buzzsaws and blades join the fray. Disregarding them too, she climbs higher still, getting mangled and sliced, degraded, and stripped of her dress as she reaches her goal. The final insult awaits her at the end of her climb. Her vision of freedom was just a drawing made in crayon. There is no escape. Tojo's climb is met with a crushing fall, and her body slams into Monosuke below her. She dies with the doodle of freedom landing on her, slowly stained by her blood. This execution ranks in at number 3 because of the message it sends to the class. No matter how hard you resist, no matter what you're willing to undergo, and no matter how hard you try, there is no hope of survival. Tojo as a character is one of the most skilled in the entire history of the franchise, and this scenario makes an example of her for all to see. There is no way to outrun despair, and there's no way to escape punishment. The only reason this didn't make it to number 2 on the list is because this execution has very little to do with her main talent of being the ultimate maid, and instead focuses on her secret role as Japan's Prime Minister. The execution of Kaede Akamatsu reigns in at number 2 on this list. It's there for a few reasons. The first is the overall impact this execution has on the class. After a very confusing trial, the pianist is found guilty, and her motive is made clear. Despite her good intentions, she must face the punishment for her crimes instead of walking free. Now, it's worth noting that this was a self-inflicted punishment, given that she could have just used the first blood perk to escape in the first place. Akamatsu's execution hangs her by the neck as her body is used to play a piano number with Maestro Monokuma. This death is drawn out, slow, painful, and loaded with irony. It has a tremendous impact on her classmates who watch on in horror, and though it instills some inspiration and hope into some of them, it also breaks their hearts, especially that of Saihara Shuichi. This execution is one of the few that features the entire class as witnesses in the execution itself, just as Leon's did before, and it sets a terrifying precedent of what will happen to those who get caught. All of this, combined with the fact that Kaede didn't actually commit the murder herself, puts this at number 2 on our list. At long last, we've reached number 1 on our list. The ultimate execution belongs to none other than Chiaki Nanami. The death of the ultimate gamer is one that many will remember forever as being heartbreaking and undeserved. But before I go any further, I should probably take a step back because I'm not talking about the execution from Danganronpa 2. The number 1 spot on this list goes to the unnamed execution of Chiaki Nanami in Danganronpa 3. In this drawn-out nightmare, Nanami is forced to go through a death dungeon loaded to the brim with traps, with a lingering hope that she can somehow find a way out. As she progresses through the dungeon, her body is slashed, stabbed, and tortured by assorted obstacles, while her classmates, through the use of brainwashing techniques, are forced to watch on in horror as their dear beloved class rep is put to death. After fighting and fighting, Nanami finally reaches an exit, but instead of being granted her freedom, she is impaled by several spears. As the screen flashes game over, her entire class submits to the influence of despair, transforming into a terror that would later be known the world over as the Ultimate Despairs. Another thing about this execution is that it wasn't as scripted as the others in the series usually are. Nanami could have died at any point during, and had to rely on her experience in games to survive for as long as she did. Even Junko takes the time to praise her for making it so far, despite the inevitable ending. The last thing that really pushes this execution above all others is the effect it has on even Izuru Kamakura, who despite having lost all memory of his past life, cries as Nanami dies before him. No matter how detached he had become, Nanami's tragic death and the impact she had on Hinata is more powerful than even the Ultimate Hope's indifference. For all of these reasons, the execution of Chiaki Nanami in Danganronpa 3 is the ultimate execution on my list. With that, we've reached the end of my top 10 Danganronpa executions. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to let me know what you thought of the list. Do you agree or disagree? Do you think another execution should have made the cut instead? Or maybe you think the placement's out of order? I want to hear what you have to say in the comments of this video. If you enjoyed the video, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel for more similar content in the future. As always, this is Stanpai. Thank you so much for tuning in. Class is now dismissed.